Hola, ¿cómo están? Le damos la bienvenida al segundo día en Nerdiala 101.
Bienvenidos, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Pucha.
Y Marto.
Nosotros ahora vamos a presentar la charla que viene de RESTful y dice una introducción a las pruebas de API en Python.
Exacto, y por supuesto todo el código que nos va a mostrar Bas va a estar disponible para que después de la charla se lo puedan bajar y hacer las pruebas con él.
Necesarias y cómo escribir pruebas para las APIs RESTful con solo un par de líneas de código.
Muy bueno, la verdad, Pucha, excelente.
Sí, excelente. Vamos a la charla entonces. Si tienen preguntas para Bas, recuerden que las pueden escribir en el chat y cualquier cosa, si no llegamos con el tiempo, las pueden dejar y se contestarán después.
Vamos a nerdear. Vamos a nerdear.
Hello, everybody at Nerdeala. Welcome to my session. My name is Bas Dijkstra. I am currently the director of the Inspired Academy at Inspired Testing. And before I joined Inspired Testing, I've been a software testing and test automation consultant and trainer for 15 years. And in this session today, I would like to tell you a little bit and more importantly, show you how to write tests for APIs in Python using the requests library and the pytest unit testing framework. But before we start and before we dive into the code, I would like to tell you a little bit about APIs and why API testing is such an important skill. As you probably know, systems are getting ever more distributed, where back in the days we had a lot of monoliths, a lot of where the entire application was just in a single code base. Nowadays, systems are more and more distributed, meaning they are constructed out of loosely coupled components that often communicate with one another and exchange data through APIs. All of these components, they might be developed in different teams, different departments, maybe even different organizations. And that means that for any development team, it's very important to test their interface, test their APIs, because those APIs are going to be consumed by other teams, other development. So you want to make sure that your API behaves as you intend it to do. Which means there's a lot of demand these days for API testing skills. What I want to show you in this session, again, is how to start testing APIs, exploring APIs, and also write automation to support the testing of your APIs. Let me get started by sharing my screen with you. So what I'm going to do is I am going to show you PyCharm. PyCharm is a Python editor, and what we'll get started with is just a completely blank new project. And that project, let's call that our Nerdeala API testing project, because I think that's an interesting name for our project. Get rid of this IDE error. So the first thing we need to do after PyCharm is done with creating my new project is add a tool, add a library that can help us write tests for our APIs. There are a lot of different libraries in the Python language that can help you do that. My personal favorite is the request library. The request library is a wrapper around the standard Python HTTP library. I can install it add it to my project by installing it through pip. And what again, what I like about requests is that it gives you a lot of power, it gives you a lot of flexibility, but you don't need to do a whole lot of coding to write tests for APIs, which I'm going to show. Let us start by creating a new Python module, importing the requests library, and then creating an API request and inspecting the response, or in this case, because we're just exploring this, we're not writing any automated tests yet. I just wanted to do some exploration on the API. All I need to do is make the API call. Now, the API that we are going to explore is, or at least the start, is this endpoint. It's a dummy test API endpoint, which contains some user data, just some test data for different users. So in this case, we are going to retrieve data for the user with user ID 1, and we are going to inspect some of the characteristics of the response. So what I can do is I say, well, get, and instead of typing it out, let's just copy the endpoint from here. And what I can, so for example, do is tell it to tell it to extract the status code, which is part of the response object that's being returned by requests when I send an HTTP GET. So if I run my script here, it tells me that the status code is equal to 200, which is already useful information because that's a status code that I would expect here. I could also print my response headers, for example. So the metadata that's describing the response. With requests, that's also part of this response object, and that's this headers dictionary. So and this gives me a list of all the response headers that are being returned by the API, which I can then inspect visually to see if the headers are there that I expect, or if the headers that if there are any headers that I think are unexpected or weird, or that I want to further explore to see what's happening there. Or I might want to, I might be interested in the data, which in this case, I'm going to try and pretty print through the Python built-in JSON library, because that helps me a lot in pretty printing this output. And what it prints to the console here is, well, in this case, the same data as we saw in our browser. So that just goes to show you that writing, invoking an API, sending a request to an API, capturing the response, and writing some characteristics of that response, be it the status code or the response headers or the response body, is quite straightforward using the requests library. So that's pretty useful for exploratory testing. To just you need a tool anyway to do exploratory testing on APIs. But let's see if we can also turn these into some automated tests. To do that, I'm going to remove my exploratory testing module and add a new one that's called API tests. To efficiently write and run tests, I also need a unit testing framework. I'm a big fan of pytest, so that is what I'm going to install and add to my project next. And let me import requests into this module again. Say, well, test. Let's again start with a test against the status code. And just like I did with when I was exploring the API, I can simply do a get here. And now instead of printing my status code to the console to be inspected by a human being, I want to add an assertion for that. And let's say I want to assert that this status code is equal to 200. If I now run this test using pytest and then the name of the module, it tells me that it has found one test, it has run one test, and that one test passed, and it took it 320 milliseconds. Just to show you that this is actually running a test here, let me change the expected status code and run the test again. And as you can see, there's actually an assertion being done because now my test fails because it asserts that it tries to compare 200 and 201 and says, well, those two are unequal, so it fails the test. So this is something like the hello world of API testing in Python. Adding requests to your project, performing an HTTP GET, and asserting that the status code is equal to 200. I can, for example, also say, well, maybe I want to inspect the content type header of the response, and that is probably something like application JSON. It's not, because it's application JSON with a character set of UTF-8, which means that it should be this instead. That makes my test pass again. So this is the value of my content type header. So the headers property of the response object is actually just a Python dictionary, which means you can access the values for specific headers just as you would access a value in any Python.
Falta el punto y coma, la base no conecta, nagios en rojo y el ping no me responde. Somos nerds, quédate en tu container.
Let's say now instead, I'm not interested in the status code or in the header. I want to extract I want to write some checks for an API response body or a response body element, an API response body element. I need to perform an intermediate step there, and that's actually extracting the JSON from the response, which I do by calling the JSON method on the response object that extracts the JSON body response and stores it into a new variable. I can then, for example, say, let's say I am interested in this specific field, so the name field. I can then access that name field again, not by name, but by name. And that should be equal to Lee and Graham. So run our test again. That passes. If I would change that to Jones, again, the test fails because it expects Lee and Jones, but the actual name returned was Lee and Graham, which tells us that it's actually, in fact, calling the API and inspecting the response. Maybe I'm interested in this value, so the longitude of the place where Lee and Graham lives. I could also do that by saying body, and that's accessed through address, geo, longitude. And I think this is actually a string value, and it is, which makes comparison a lot easier. There we go. And if I change this to a different number, again, it's going to complain that it's, well, it's actually 496 and not 495. So using this JSON method, it's really straightforward to extract the JSON response body from the response object and assert on individual values of this response body. Another thing that I would like to do is, so until now we've retrieved data from an API, but maybe I also want to post data to an API. Let's say that we've got a different endpoint here. Show you that quickly. That accepts new posts. If we look at a post has a user ID. Let's just look at an individual example. A user ID, an ID which is auto-generated, so we don't need to specify that. A title and a body. So let's create a new with a user ID equal to 1, a title, and say this is my new post title, and a body that says, well, here goes the body of my fancy new blog post, maybe. So this is the content, this is the data, the payload that I want to send to the API. I want to send that to the API now, but now instead of a GET, I need to use an HTTP post. And I need to post that to the posts endpoint. But I also need a way to send the data. And the way I send the data is by specifying that as a JSON argument and passing in the object. What the requests will do is take this JSON or this Python dictionary, which it is, and just a collection of key value pairs, and convert that into JSON. And now I can assert that the response status code is equal to 201, which is a very typical HTTP status code for a successful post. There we go, my test passes again. And if I would say, well, I want to make sure that what I've posted is actually what I expected it to do, is I could, for example, say print a response, and through the response I can also access properties of the request. What I only need to do now is pass the -s flag to actually print this to the console. And there you go. Here I've got the actual body that was posted, and that's part of the request body, so the data that I actually posted to this endpoint. As a final example, I want to show you how to do parameterized testing in requests and Python. That's something I use fairly often in when creating and running API tests. And by parameterized testing, I mean invoking the same endpoint multiple times, just with different sets of data. So let's create that data first. So for example, I've got user ID 1, Leanne Graham. 2 is Irving Howell. Please don't ask me why I know this off the top of my head, but I do. And user 3 is called Clementine. So this is my user data, my 3 test cases. Now I need to import pytest as well, because pytest, my unit testing framework, is going to help me to do this. And I pass in a user ID and an expected name through the user data object dev test user names, which I pass in the user ID. let's do Pythonic names and go and say our response is request. I'm doing a get again to typecode.com/ oh, this should be a formatted string users with the user ID and then assert that. Oops, let's extract the body again because I want to make sure that for each of these user IDs, the value of the name element in the response body is equal to the expected value here. So I need first extract the body again and check that the name is equal to the expected name. And if I now run the test, even though I've only written a single test method, because I parameterized it using pytest, what's going to happen is that it's going to run this one test method 3 times, once for each of these data sets. There we go. As you can see, if you count the dots, you can also see it in the console. It has run 3 tests. It has run this one test method 3 times, once for each of these data sets. And just to show you that it actually works, let's change this user ID from 2 to 4. So it's going to invoke, it's going to get data for user 1 in the first test case, user 4 in the second test case, and user 3 in the third test case. You see that the second iteration, so this one now fails because the data that's associated, or the name that's associated to the user with user ID 4 is not Irvin Howell, it's actually Patricia Lepzak, which means that it just goes to show you that it actually performs the expected API calls and validates and actually performs the validations that we wanted to perform. I guess since we have almost run out of time, that's it for me. I hope that this session has shown you. So we've very quickly went through a couple of different things. Setting up a new project, using requests to do some exploring on APIs, writing some straightforward tests on the RESTful APIs, posting data and checking response characteristics there, and also parameterize the data-driven testing. I hope that these examples helped you to see that it's fairly straightforward to use Python, and especially the combination of requests and pytest to write useful, powerful, flexible, versatile, readable tests for your RESTful APIs in Python. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful conference, wonderful event at Mediala. And I hope to see you again at another point in time. Thank you very much.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos. están bienvenidos. We have here Buzz with us. We just saw his talk, and we have a lot of questions for you. Let's go with the first one. This is from Diego Colombo, and he asked, mainly for APIs, what is the advantage of using this kind of testing, Python testing, against Postman collections?
Well, what I am, and I think I sort of kind of answered this in the chat already, but I'm happy to do it again. I don't think this is do it better than using Postman. It's just a different approach of writing tests. So choosing to write your test in code compared to writing and running your tests using a low-code solution like Postman, it's a trade-off between ease of use. And a low-code solution like Postman is typically a little bit easier to use, easier to get started with. But on the other hand, you have code-based solutions which give you more flexibility. And what's the best fit for your situation or your context? Well, it depends, as any good consultant will tell you. So sometimes writing things in code can be a better fit for your context because you need the flexibility and you have the people who have the skills to write these tests in code. And hopefully what you've seen from the talk, writing API tests in Python using requests is, well, not really all that difficult. It's fairly easy to get started with. It doesn't require a lot of code. But for some people still, tools like Postman, which gives you a lot of options out of the box, and you basically just drag and drop and click your tests together. That's a better choice and a better fit for them. So it really depends. So but again, the most important thing to remember is that you're making a trade-off between the flexibility of writing tests in code and, well, the ease of use and the ready-made building blocks that a local tool like Postman gives you.
Right, okay, great. So let's go with the next one, and this is from Sebastian, and he asked, when testing APIs that use JSON for its request response, do you assert for JSON schemas in your test? If so, which libraries or libraries would you recommend?
Yeah, again, I posted the link in the chat in response to this question. So requests itself doesn't really support it, but there's a really useful library called JSON Schema, which kind of makes sense, available in Python. And you can use that quite easily to, once you've extracted your JSON response from, or the JSON response body from the response that you get when you use requests, it's fairly easy to compare that to a previously defined schema and see if that the actual response returned by the API conforms to that schema. So there are probably there's probably more than one library in Python that can do that, but JSON schema would be a good start.
Great. Okay, let's go with Julian question. He says, I have 4 to 5 integrations in prod and not a single test. I'm willing to start testing my code, but don't know how or where to start. What do you advise to him?
I can't really tell you where to start exactly because I don't know what's important or what the critical things are that you need to test.
Right.
No, I can't. Without more information about it, I can't really tell you what to test. But I think you mentioned Fast API. Well, that's a framework for building APIs, which makes it fairly easy to write unit tests for some of the logic. So that's what I would start. So I actually wouldn't start using a request. I would, well, maybe try it for yourself or have a conversation with the developers and see what part of the business logic or of the behavior of that API you can test through unit tests and maybe using pytest, but not necessarily requests. And then have a couple of key tests that actually spin up the API, which is really straightforward using Fast API in your tests, and then do some tests using requests as well. But I wouldn't just use requests because the fewer tests you have that actually make the HTTP calls, because they're a little bit more expensive, they take a little bit longer to run, and covering most of the logic through unit tests, which directly interact with your source code. I think that would be beneficial. It's basically following that test automation pyramid that we've been keeping.
Okay,
we've been talking about.
Great. So we have a minute left. So I'm going to ask you the last question. What difference do you see with Java when doing API testing?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that for me?
Yes. What difference do you see with Java when doing API testing?
With Java?
Yeah.
A lot, but then very little. So the syntax is different, the libraries are different, but the things that you're testing are exactly the same. So the previous question that was fast API and Python, if you would have asked me that question, but say use Spring Boot and Java, my answer would be exactly the same. It's just the libraries that are different. So in Java, just as with Python, you have libraries that make your life a whole lot easier if you do this. So and my favorite library in Java is REST, but that's like request is just one of the many libraries you can use there. REST is one of the many libraries in Java that you can use to do this.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. We run out of time, so
sorry. Yeah,
we have to go. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much. I hope I can see you next year. Y nosotros nos seguimos con Nerdearla. Si tienen más preguntas, las pueden dejar en el chat y serán respondidas.
Vamos a nerdear.